It's Friday, October 18th, 2024, and we are 17 days away from the election. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. Today on the show, Donald Trump crosses the line into fascism, and experts are sounding the alarms. And unfortunately, our guest canceled late today, so no interview in this episode, which means you'll have more of me, but I promise not too much more. I'm going to add a bunch of extra clips in here so it's not just a lot of my voice. That being said, let's get to your headlines. On Sunday, a relative of a 22-year-old Afghani man who was planning an attack on Election Day in Oklahoma was arrested in France for plotting a terror attack there during a soccer match. That man who was plotting an attack here in the U.S. was arrested back on October 7th. That man was 27-year-old Nasir Ahmad Tawedi, an Afghani national who was plotting an attack on Election Day in Oklahoma using an assault rifle. Two sources told NBC News that Tawedi was working as a security guard for the CIA in Afghanistan. The Biden administration said that man entered the U.S. in 2021, about a month after the chaotic exit of U.S. forces. And the Biden administration said that he had been through a vetting process twice and no red flags had been raised. Now, it's unclear if he and his relative, who was left unnamed, were planning to coordinate their attacks. On Tuesday, two major rulings came down in the swing state of Georgia. The first was a ruling from the Fulton County Superior Court, which is where Atlanta is. A judge shot down a challenge that was brought by a Trump-backed member of the county board who said that she didn't have to certify the election under state law. The judge said she did, citing a specific portion of that same law that said boards shall certify, making their roles more like rubber stamps than law enforcement. And then later that same day, the judge temporarily halted the ruling from the State Board of Electors that would have forced election workers to hand count every ballot. Now, I talked about this before in MIMS Mini 35 called Changing the Count, but basically, hand counting leads to more human error and more error in general and takes a lot longer, which leaves the door open for doubt and misinformation to sneak in. That temporary halt was then backed up on Wednesday by a second ruling from a Georgia judge. It could get appealed, though likely not before the election. On Thursday, the independent panel looking into the first attempted assassination of former President Trump recommended new leadership and, quote, fundamental reform within the Secret Service, saying without it, more major security failures like the one that led to the shooting can and will happen. Though they stopped short of calling for the current director, or acting director rather, to resign. The 52-page report, which was ordered by President Biden to happen, also said that the protective service around the president and around candidates for president had become, quote, bureaucratic, complacent, and static, and said that new leadership should be an outsider, which was the same recommendation another panel that looked into Secret Service failures said about a decade ago. The current acting director of the Secret Service, Ronald Rowe, said the agency was reviewing this new report. And finally, and also on Thursday, Israel announced that defense forces on the ground in Gaza had killed Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. Sinwar was believed to be the chief architect behind the October 7th attack, in which Hamas terrorists killed 1,200 people, most of them at a music festival, and took 250 hostages. Sinwar has been a top target for Israel's campaign in Gaza, though that campaign has also meant the deaths of now more than 42,000 people, many of them civilians, and has caused a humanitarian crisis. In fact, that crisis has become so large that this week, the U.S. said if Israel doesn't allow more aid into Gaza within the next 30 days, the U.S. could cut off some of its military aid. Now, in response to the death of Sinwar, President Biden congratulated Israel, and Vice President Harris said it gives an opening to end the war in Gaza, though Hezbollah, which is an Iranian-backed terror group operating out of Lebanon to the north of Israel, said it is going to ramp up fighting in the wake of Sinwar's death and continued fighting with Israel forces there. Okay, that is it for your headlines. Let's get to today's main topic. Trump takes a hard turn towards authoritarianism that is cause for concern. So this week, there has been a lot of coverage of Donald Trump saying that he'd send the military against U.S. citizens, specifically calling out Democrats and liberals as the enemy within. Here's that, and this has been edited just for a little bit for time.
What are you expecting? Joe Biden said he doesn't think it's going to be a peaceful election day.
Well, he doesn't have any idea what's happening in all fairness. He spends most of his day sleeping. I think the bigger problem is the enemy from within, not even the people that have come in and destroying our country. By the way, totally destroying our country. The towns, the villages, they're being inundated. But I don't think they're the problem in terms of election day. I think the bigger problem are the people from within. We have some very bad people. We have some sick people, radical left lunatics. And I think they're and it should be very easily handled by, if necessary, by National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military, because they can't let that happen.
How are you going to guard against the bureaucrats undermining you?
Well, they're going to undermine. Well, I always say, so we have two enemies. We have the outside enemy, and then we have the enemy from within. And the enemy from within, in my opinion, is more dangerous than China, Russia, and all these countries, because if you have a smart president, he can handle them.
So that is something that we have never heard from a president or a presidential candidate before. He then doubled down on it just a few days later, specifically singling out several members of Congress, including California Congressman Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi.
They're very, very different. And it is the enemy from within, and they're very dangerous. They're Marxists and communists and fascists, and they're sick. I use a guy like Adam Schiff because they made up the Russia hoax. It took 2 years to solve the problem. Absolutely nothing was done wrong, et cetera, et cetera. They're dangerous for our country. We have China, we have Russia, we have all these countries. If you have a smart president, they can all be handled. The more difficult are, the Pelosi's, these people, they're so sick and they're so evil. If they would spend their time trying to make America great again, it would be so easy to make this country great. But when I heard about that, they were saying I was like threatening. I'm not threatening anybody. They're the ones doing the threatening. They do phony investigations. I've been investigated more than Alphonse Capone. He was the greatest gangster. No, it's true. No, but think of it. It's called weaponization of government. It's a terrible thing.
All right.
They're the threat to democracy.
And it's comments like that that have led to a lot of serious people saying that Donald Trump has gone with flirting with authoritarianism into full-blown fascism. And I think it's time to look at those claims. So, not to be the guy who reads the dictionary definition of something to you like it's a bad 8th grade speech, but I'm gonna be the guy who reads the dictionary definition to you of fascism. So Merriam-Webster defines it like this: a political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual and that stands for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. It's the working definition that experts are using, and it's a form of authoritarianism that often gets conflated with things like communism or socialism, and while they share similarities, they aren't the same. I am, however, going to use fascism and authoritarianism interchangeably here so things just don't get boring to listen to, but anyway, here's Ruth Ben-Ghiat, an expert on right-wing authoritarians and author of the book Strongman, talking about Trump back in March and why he and the MAGA movement fit so neatly into this definition.
So Mussolini actually, who was a journalist, he was a great sloganeer, he gave, obviously he created fascism. So one very simple definition, he called it a revolution of reaction. And both those things are true because it upends everything, it disrupts everything, it uses violence. Mm-hmm. Fascists believe that violence is the way to change history. And Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida, he came to the Iowa State Fair to help Trump in the summer. People are eating their corn dogs and there's kids there. And he says, only through force will we bring change to corrupt DC. And this is after the coup that tried to do that. Mm-hmm. So that's the revolution part. And people are given permission to be their most violent selves, their worst selves. It's a collapse of morals. The reaction is what I was saying before, where you want to turn the clock back to the good old days, right? So MAGA is make the nation great again by going back to times when, women knew their place as, non-whites and non-Christians, and so things were as they should be. So this is the part of authoritarianism, which is also a set of attitudes about child rearing, about traditions, about like male authority. And so all of that Trump says is threatened. And so the MAGA base is responding to that.
So Trump's language has long, at the very least, had elements of what Ben-Ghiat was talking about there, and from the definition that I just read, which I'm going to go through piece by piece here. His whole slogan, to start off with, is about the nation. America First, which, by the way, is borrowed from a proto-fascist movement in the U.S. in the 1940s under Charles Lindbergh. Yeah, that Charles Lindbergh, the guy who flew and then the missing baby, the whole thing. Now, he wanted to stay out of World War II, but was also friendly with the Nazis. America First then and now is less about the patriotism of the ideals that are in our Constitution, but about the land and the people, or at least the people who support Trump. Case in point, he sells a Bible with the lyrics to the song God Bless the USA in it, which is a song all about the land and the places of the U.S., but not necessarily the people or its ideals. And if you don't believe me, go back and look at the lyrics. They don't really talk about the ideas of freedoms or the goodness of people as the ideals of Americana. It's all about places. The next thing here, Trump has always talked about race in very stark terms, and instances of racist language and accusations of racism levied against him have been part and parcel to his time in office and as a candidate going all the way back to 2015, but recently he's been more explicitly violent. During this campaign, he has called immigrants vermin who are poisoning the blood of this country, echoing Hitler directly. In that clip I played earlier, he even talked about towns and cities being overrun by immigrants. He's been preoccupied with Kamala Harris's race, and just this week, Trump said this.
Would you rather have the black president or the white president who got $1.7 billion off the price? I think they want the white guy right now.
Now, Trump was speaking in terms of the economy there, but that's not how a lot of people interpreted that or heard it. And again, just this week, he said that black and Hispanic people would be to blame in part for his loss if they voted for Harris and should get their heads examined.
American or Hispanic, and you know how well I'm doing there, that votes for Kamala, you got to have your head examined because they are really screwing you.
He's also frequently, during this campaign, singled out Jewish people, saying an almost identical thing. He warned that Jewish people would be to blame for his loss in 2024 at an event about ending anti-Semitism just over a month ago.
But I will put it to you very simply and gently. I really haven't been treated right, but you haven't been treated right because you're putting yourself in great danger, and the United States hasn't been treated right. So if I don't win this election, and I've been very good, they say Trump's been right about everything. I've been right about a lot of things. Even Ted will admit that. I've been right about a lot of things that a lot of people said, no, that won't happen, but a lot of bad things happened, and some good things I've been right about too. And I only want to be, so I'm not going to call this as a prediction, but in my opinion, the Jewish people would have a lot to do with a loss. If I'm at 40%, if I'm at 40%, think of it. That means 60% are voting for Kamala, who in particular.
So again, another instance in which Trump has singled out a group of people based on their race or ethnicity, and just recently here. And that doesn't even go into his immigration policies that through his staffers have deep ties to the idea that white Americans are being replaced by non-white Americans, which you heard Ben-Ghiat talking about just a little bit ago. The next part of this definition is the movement is centered around a single figure. There is no question that Trump is that figure. There is no shortage of the kind of hero worship effect that Trump has on his supporters, but it's not just his voters. Even after January 6th, when members of Congress like Senators Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham or former Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy said they were finished with Trump, all eventually came back around to supporting him again to prop up their party because there was no other leader that people were going to follow. Trump has also been explicit about economic and social regimentation. He's threatened to place tariffs on imported goods that would punish American companies and consumers. He's frequently put American companies in the crosshairs of those economic punishments, most recently against John Deere. He also frequently sought to punish people for breaking his view of an ideal American society and has in this campaign talked about ending diversity and equity programs. He's frequently bragged about ending Roe v. Wade and being in support of state abortion bans. He's furthered anti-gay and anti-trans views, including book bans and going after trans athletes, specifically trans women. He's also gone after academics and university students, explicitly saying during the pro-Palestinian protests this summer on college campuses that he wanted to deport college students who support Hamas or had Hamas-sympathizing views and run immigrants through ideological screenings. All of those things are now parts of his official immigration platform. And this part about going after universities is right out of the authoritarian playbook. Here's Yale professor and author of the book on fascism called Erasing History, Jason Stanley, talking about it just last month.
So this tactic of tarring school teachers, tarring university professors as Marxists and communists and ruining the country, and replacing this kind of education, replacing Black history, replacing LGBTQ perspectives by a kind of grandiosity of white Christian nationalism, as we're seeing right now. This seemed to me a democratic emergency.
And that brings us to the final part of this definition: suppression of opponents. And up until now, pretty much everything that I've talked about has just been words. This is about actual physical violence, like the clips that I played at the beginning. And the thing is that this aspect of his views aren't new. This has just been the most explicit. During the George Floyd protests back in 2020, he wanted to send in the military to shoot protesters. Here's his former Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, talking about that back in 2022.
The meeting started off pretty loud. The president was enraged. He was very upset at what had been happening, and it happened the night before. He thought that the protests made the country look weak, made us look weak, and us meant him. And he wanted to do something about it. And as we went back and forth discussing a number of things, to include the deployment of 10,000 active duty troops, as you mentioned, we reached that point in the conversation where he looked frankly at General Milley and said, "Can't you just shoot them? Just shoot them in the legs or something." And it was not just it was a question in the form of or a suggestion in the form of a question. And we were just all taken aback at that moment as this issue just hung very heavily in the air.
And then just 3 days ago, Esper was on CNN and said this about Trump's latest calls to go after political opponents.
When you hear what Trump is talking about, do you take those comments seriously?
Well, I think we should always take the comments of political leaders and other leaders seriously. Absolutely. He's spoken about this before. If you recall, a year ago or so, he spoke about a second Trump term being about retribution. So, yes, I think we should take those words seriously.
And it's not just Esper. A number of former Trump staffers and aides have said that he is dangerous, including Trump's former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which are the people who head the military and then give advice directly to the president. That man, former General Mark Milley, told journalist Bob Woodward for his new book, quote, "No one has ever been as dangerous to this country," saying that Trump was, quote, "a fascist to the core." Trump has also repeatedly called for retribution against his opponents through the legal system and using the Department of Justice, including targeting Democrats, former staffers who have spoken out, journalists, and even late-night talk show hosts, which would be considered acts of state violence. Now, I know that all of this sounds really bad, and that's because it is. And I think that so many of us, because we have lives and we are glued to this stuff 24/7 and it all moves so fast, have sort of lost sight of just how high all of these things have stacked up. But to put it another way, I'll leave it to Carl Bernstein, the veteran journalist who said this on CNN just a few days ago, that America has a choice and it might be the most important one we've ever had to make.
But what we now see in these closing weeks is that this is a campaign in which there is going to be a reaffirmation of regular political order in this country, or there's going to be a real triumph of fascism in which good, well-meaning Republicans have allowed themselves to get carried down this path and go along with this rhetoric. That is really what these, absolutely. Let's listen to General Milley saying of Donald Trump, fascist to the core, the most dangerous man in America. General Milley is a pretty level guy. Let's listen to what Donald Trump is telling us.
Okay, I know that was a lot, which is why it's time now for TLTO, or Too Long Tuned Out, where I tell you just the stuff you need to know from the stuff you just heard. So in recent weeks and days, Donald Trump has escalated his violent language to a level we have never seen before, specifically suggesting multiple times he would use the military against American citizens and his political opponents. His entire campaign fits pretty well into the definition of authoritarianism and outright fascism, espousing everything from a rigid social and economic structure to violent suppression of his opponents and opposing thought to a fixation on race and changing demographics from quote-unquote the way we used to be. And experts have been sounding the alarm about it, including people who used to run the military under Donald Trump. Okay, that is it for today's Make It Make Sense. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you listen to this on. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications on YouTube so you don't miss out on anything there. And also, if you're not watching this on the Substack, go ahead and subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack. It's just $5 a month for full access to everything. I've got good bonus content up there. You can dig through a lot of that right now as we get closer to the election. I'm also going to put a backlog up of some of these Make It Make Sense mini episodes, the ones that I think are probably the ones you really need to know about before we hit election day here. So be on the lookout for those if you're a subscriber. And as always, share the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll be back with another mini episode tomorrow.